Salem's Lot by Stephen King, one of his most beloved and scariest novels. So how did this 2024 adaptation compare to the novel? Well, I had a chance to watch it last night on HBO Max, and I have some thoughts. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm Nikhil with Shelf-Esteem. I'm a composer, now also booktuber. You can find my music in The Wheel of Time Season 2, His Dark Materials Season 3, and the newly released psychological horror film, Dead Whisper. Now, I had some thoughts about the 2024 adaptation, which I got a chance to watch last night, and I wanted to kind of discuss that in a non-spoiler and then, of course, spoilery, and I'll leave some timestamps below kind of where the spoiler section begins. So if you want to watch it with no spoilers, you can feel free to do so. So before I launch into kind of my thoughts on this, if you like this kind of video, please like and subscribe. I'm always trying to figure out ways to link, my love of books and then also love and knowledge of adaptations, because I think, we all love books, we love reading, but we also love to see how these things look on the big and small screen. So it's always fun to do those comparisons. Sometimes adaptations like, for example, Stephen King's It or The Shining, even if they deviate from the original, they capture a spirit that, transcends pop culture. And then there are other times, other adaptations come out and they don't do quite so well. So let's analyze where this kind of falls. So when I saw that announcement, I thought, okay, could go either way. Let's see what happens, And then I saw that the movie was shelved for 2 years. And, we thought maybe it wouldn't even be released. So, my thought was like, are they just kind of waiting for the right time? Because, maybe they want to do a big theatrical release and, with the pandemic and everything going on at the time, maybe it just wasn't the right time. The second thought also occurred to me, was it so bad that they were afraid to release it? So that was kind of where I was falling, the two camps I was falling in. And I'm starting to realize why they were hesitant to release it, because I think it kind of falls in the latter category. But before we launch into that, let's talk a little bit about the pros. So the first 8 to 10 minutes or so of the film, you have the Gordon Lightfoot song Sundown, which kind of played in the theatrical trailer, and that was a really nice vibe for it. This movie really screams Halloween vibes, the movie, I felt like the locations, the set pieces were quite well done, actually. And I thought the casting in terms of like the look, the aesthetic of the Marston house, the look of these different characters, they all kind of really looked like how I would have imagined it. One other thing I really did like about the adaptation is they were hearkening back to 1975. They didn't try to like age it into modern, kind of a modern take on the story. And I felt like, when you read that book, it is a product of its time. So you really feel the mid-70s vibe in it. So the fact that they captured that was really nice. But, a lot of movies suffer when they try to do that, in that they try to, it feels like a throwback, like, hey, remember that thing from 1975? Isn't that so cool? And I felt like one thing they did really well was they captured an authenticity of that era. And I really like that aspect of it. Now, another pro of this film, I think, was the soundtrack. Nathan Barr and Lisbeth Scott did the soundtrack for this film. And I really think that they are fantastic composers. I met Nathan Barr before. He has a studio called Bandrika Studios in LA. And he's incredible. I mean, he's worked on, I think, American Horror Story, The Americans. He did House with a Clock in Its Walls. I'm trying to remember what else. True Blood. And he's just he's a composer's composer. Like, he is a guy who took the original organ from the 1920s that was on the Fox lot and bought it and built a 2-story studio to house this thing. He's like that kind of level of dedication and commitment. And I felt like the score was a little bit different to, regular horror scores. Like, you listen to the main title theme. I'm going to link that below as well, just because I'm a fan of kind of what they're doing with the score. And I think like they used interesting instruments. They used real instruments. They weren't just kind of playing with sample libraries and generic sounds. So that was another thing that I felt like was a pro. Now, unfortunately, that's where my pros kind of end, and I have quite a few cons. So these are going to be non-spoilery, and I'm going to get into some spoilers in a little bit. But so I have this theory that in horror films, the more you show, unless you do it right, you look at an adaptation like It. They showed quite a bit, of Pennywise the Clown there, especially in the more horrific sequences. But they did it very focused in making it look as scary as possible. So then it was great. in a particular kind of adaptation where they're not necessarily focusing on making it look as good as possible and having less scares, but they're just focusing on packing in scares. Then it becomes like, if you're going to go that route, what you don't show is what makes it scarier. I felt like they showed way too much of the vampires, and the CGI really kind of shows its limitations in this film. I think if they'd stuck with more practical effects, actually, ironically, like the 1979 adaptation or the miniseries, did really well. Like, you look at that and it looks dated, but somehow it looks creepier because it feels more real. You know, when you look at like glowing eyes and stuff like that, and you see these vampires and stuff, it just doesn't really land. Like, it's not that scary. So I think that was my first big issue. And I think this is something that like a lot of films, not just adaptations, but a lot of films suffer from, is their, kind of very liberal use of CGI, but then showing everything. Like, you don't want to show everything. If a vampire is coming out of the shadows and all you see are the teeth and the eyes, that would be so much scarier, right? But I think that was the first thing that I felt like it really suffered from. The second thing I think was the acting was very uneven for me personally. I think that is due to two factors. One, the character backstories are so fleshed out in the Stephen King novel. You know, you're reading newspaper articles, you're finding about Ben Mears' backstory and things like that. A lot of that stuff is glossed over because of the medium, 2-hour film. You don't really have time to kind of put all that stuff in. And that's an unfortunate circumstance of the medium. I think if they'd done it as a miniseries, it actually could have benefited in this case. But because they're glossing over these backstories and they're rushing from one thing to the next, to pack everything in 2 hours, you really don't feel for the characters. And also, it felt like the characters themselves, the actors, didn't feel for their own characters because they weren't able to deliver performances that felt magnetic, on the screen, or really translated those characters and did justice kind of to their backstories. So I think that was my second issue with it. I'm not, saying that the actors are at fault. It really could have been just the pacing and kind of the way the story was interpreted for the screen. So I think that kind of played through. And, it's like everything starts with the writing, right? So if the writing is rushed, the acting performances are going to feel rushed and everything is going to feel flimsy like a house of cards. So that was, something that I really felt like was its biggest detriment if you were to kind of think of a high level thing that really made it feel that way. The second thing, speaking of rushing through the plot, there was so much rushing in this film that it was almost dizzying, if that made sense. Like, there's one small conversation about vampires and suddenly everybody believes vampires exist, there's no gradual understanding or unfolding of this lore of vampires and kind of people being skeptical about them or anything like that. It's just kind of like one small conversation, literally like a 2-minute conversation, and everyone's suddenly on board and now everything is kind of feels real. And that doesn't really make sense and it doesn't feel very believable. But it's like, by the time you get to that point, your mind doesn't even have time to adjust because the film is on to the next thing. And I think every single part of the climactic moments that should have felt climactic felt like they were under-delivered and underperformed because there just simply wasn't enough time. Even some of the confrontations, I'm not going to go into spoilers on that right now, but even some of the confrontations felt like they happened and suddenly it's cutting to the next scene that tonally feels completely different. So you just feel dizzy watching it. And it just, I don't know, it just doesn't really feel authentic to King. I think King always was so good at the slow burn. I think, somebody who does that really well is Mike Flanagan. You look at any of his adaptations, he really knows how to pace things in a way that does justice to the Stephen King novels. So, of course, if he's able to do it, then it's proof that it's possible to be done in a film setting, right? So I understand that the conventions of film make it harder to, adapt a novel that's so complex. But at the same time, it's been done before. So I just really feel like it is actually possible. And it just kind of requires a different type of pacing style. And a little less emphasis on the jump scare vampire kind of stuff. A little bit more on the character development. It would have made the vampires scarier, actually. Just kind of pulling up my list here. There was a couple of terrifying scenes that I think made the book that it actually completely skipped. And it gave certain character arcs, I guess, to other characters or backstories to other characters. And it didn't really mesh well because then you didn't really care about those particular characters that were going through this turmoil. And, missing some of these terrifying scenes, it's like those were the things that made that book for me. And so many readers, I mean, you look at Reddit threads and stuff talking about Salem's Lot, some of the things that they really loved, that they were like, oh, I will always remember reading that as a kid and how much it stuck out to me, completely glossed over in the film. So that was an unfortunate circumstance. So moving down the list, another con is, I mentioned earlier in the video, I work on a lot of adaptations myself. So I've been privy to some of the conversations that studio executives have with each other and then also with the creatives that are working on a project. Now, I can speak from the musical standpoint, of course, but I've noticed, I've spoken to development executives, I've spoken to people in production as well, and I feel like this is kind of a common occurrence, is that a lot of the studio executives apply what is called like a checklist method. And this film really felt like that. It almost felt like, oh, have we covered these plot points? And it literally feels like they're going down a checklist. Now, if they're doing that and we don't see that, we see a great film. That's great. That's fine. If that's part of the process, that's fine. But the worst thing that can happen is a film that looks like you're going down a checklist because everything is so rushed. And it really felt like they were trying to cover their story beats. They're like, okay, have we included this type of character, that type of character? And it shows in the film, and also, this film, now this was delayed for 2 years. I don't know exactly like what didn't make it into the film, what was left on the cutting room floor. Were they still deciding like editorial decisions later in post, like in these last 2 years? I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case though, because it did look a little bit hodgepodge. Like it almost looked like there were too many cooks in the kitchen. Like oftentimes you'll see that where like studio executives, they'll have conflicting thoughts and opinions. Maybe someone who's not necessarily very close to the production will suddenly chime in with something like, hey, why don't we have these characters do that, XYZ? So it really felt like you were watching that happen in real time in this film, which is really unfortunate because that's the worst thing an audience can see, right? Is kind of the innards of the film. You should see, like I always kind of use the analogy of the Wizard of Oz. We should see the Wizard of Oz. They could be the old guy pushing the levers in the background, but we shouldn't see the old guy, right? So I think that was a real big problem in this film. I also think, kind of going back to my other point about the vampires is like they tried to go for bluster. I think that's something that like you see modern horror movies do a lot more is like emphasis on the jump scares, more, like pack it in, right? But I don't think that makes it very scary because if you don't care about the characters and if you see too much, you're not going to be really scared, right? So I think if they had focused a little bit more on some of the backstories and kind of the history of the history of the Marston house, for example, was completely glossed over. Ben Mears' backstory completely glossed over. So you just didn't really care. The subtlety, I think, would have made it a bit scarier. I think that that's something that you see certain films like A24 films do really well. So it's like when the horror hits, it really hits because there's a contrast. There's a lot of subtlety building up to it. So when you see the grotesquerie or like some, kind of blood and gore and stuff like that, means something. The power of contrast is something that I think is a nuance that's missed in certain modern horror films and specifically Stephen King adaptations. And, it's kind of ironic because it goes against the spirit of the Stephen King book in the first place. Now, let me see. There's a couple of things that really pissed me off when I was watching this as well. And now I'm going to get into spoilers, so I'm marking this in the timestamp here. So you can feel free to kind of switch off here if you'd prefer to watch it for yourself. So spoilers beginning now. So one thing that I felt was kind of insane was like, there was a part with the popsicle sticks that make the cross. Now that was something that you see in the original adaptation as well. But, they would just use weird conventions like, the cross is not working. Why isn't it working? Oh, we didn't tie it together. Okay, we got to tie it together, And then it's like, oh, let's see if this person's infected. Oh, did the cross light up? No. Okay, great. We're fine. And then it was switching to the next thing, It just like felt like kind of hammed up. Like, where did you guys get these rules? Like how did you, it felt like they were kind of making those rules up as they go in some ways. So, and even certain rules that like might have been built up, like vampire rules, I guess you could say, like the rule book that was invented by Stephen King in Salem's Lot, the conventions that they would be abiding by. Even if they did follow those conventions, it almost felt like they made it up because they were just kind of, it was almost like a Mad Libs kind of a assessment of these conventions. So I think that was a big problem. I think Father Callahan was one of my favorite characters in Stephen King's Salem's Lot, and I felt like he just got done dirty. His role was severely diminished in the film, and you know how in the book it's kind of left ambiguous as to his fate. It's further explored in another series, which I'm not going to mention anything more about because I don't want to spoil that for you. But it's kind of left ambiguous as exactly what happens to him. I think that's a wonderful way that kind of subverts expectations in the book. And of course, they had to make it overt that he gets killed off and stuff like that. I just felt like it kind of cheapened him. And we didn't really care anyways because he wasn't really a central focus of the film. So I think that was a big problem. The ending confrontation, with Barlow I felt like Barlow, he had a bit more practical effects. He did look better than, say some of the other vampires and things like that. But honestly, it still left much to be desired, showing way too much. And it wasn't as scary as, say, a Pennywise or something like that was done in the It adaptation. And then, like, he gets killed. The way he gets killed is different to the film. And then afterwards, they're like, what should we do now? Let's leave. And then the song plays, end credits. Like, there was no time to process what just happened. It just felt very cheap to me. Now, I always like to say, like, this is my opinion, this is my thoughts on it. I always say take these things with a massive grain of salt, because you may love it. And if you love it, that's fantastic. Like, I wanted to love it. I wish I loved it. I unfortunately didn't like it. And I hate saying that, because, like, I'm a pretty positive guy on this channel. Like, I never have rant reviews. I don't try to clickbait you. Like, I try to be what you see is what you get kind of guy. But this was one I kind of had to speak out about, because I'm very passionate about adaptations, because I work in the adaptation space. I know when things are done right. I know when things are not done right. And it's something I have kind of maybe a different insight into, because I've worked on stuff like that. And it just pains me that my favorite author of all time, like I always say, I have a whole shelf dedicated to the man back there. My favorite author of all time, like, I get especially, protective over his work, as I'm sure a lot of you do. So, these are my thoughts, my kind of unedited thoughts, because I just felt like I needed to put out this video and let you know how I felt about it. But definitely watch it for yourself, form your own conclusions, and let me know in the comments, like, if you agree or disagree. And, like, every opinion is valid, so it's always welcome. I don't care if we disagree, because you always, like, we've had great dialogue through this channel, just me and you all, and sometimes we'll agree, sometimes we'll disagree, and I learn something from you every time, and I hope I can do the same for you. So, it's always fun to talk about these adaptations and, kind of share our love and passion for them and for the books that kind of make them. So, with that, I'm Nikhil with Shelf-Esteem. Thank you so much again for watching. Please like and subscribe if you like this kind of video, want to see more adaptation content, and I'll see you on the next one. In the meantime, be good to yourselves, be good to each other, and have a wonderful day, y'all. Take care.